Hi all of you, this is Gil. So on this video, I'm gonna actually talk about minimum wage in the 80s versus minimum wage of today, and even the 90s as well, minimum wage. Like the question that I had to myself earlier today, which of the three eras are just maybe simply 80s and today, which of the two eras was the minimum wage more livable? Which of these two eras were more livable? Well, I could tell you this much. Well, during the 80s, the minimum wage was $3.35 an hour, and in those days, like let's say an average person worked 30 hours, like an average beginner person, like maybe an 18-year-old, 19, 20-year-old, like a teenager, basically, like gets his first job and he wants to go ahead and move on his own, right? So this person might get a minimum wage job. An average teenager might get a minimum wage at $3.35 an hour, work at McDonald's, and they may typically work 30 hours a week, right? So I mean, with 30 hours a week, that's roughly $100 a week. So that's kind of roughly there. And so they a typical beginner person or person beginning life would probably make maybe $500 to start back in the day, like back in the 80s anyway. And then so a typical teenager or starting point in their life would probably share an apartment with their friends, maybe three of them, and an average apartment was $500 in those days. Well, an average pretty decent apartment, $500. And what we used to do, like we did this, me, Arnold, and Hector, we did this, like we shared a $500 apartment, and like we made an agreement that two of us would pay $200 each to have a room, while one of us would pay $100 to live in the living room. And I did that. I paid the $100 to live in the living room. So and then you figure, like, and then back in the day, in the 80s, gasoline was like 80 cents a gallon, back in the time. So if you had a car that had a 14-gallon tank and it gave you 20 miles per gallon, let's say a typical car, so it would typically cost like maybe 12 bucks a week if you used a tank of gas in the 80s. And then you figure, like utilities, to share utilities, we would pay like maybe $25 each one of us, maybe up to 50, in those days, that's like the basic expense, the basic, that's in the 80s. So back in the day, so $200 back in the day, in the 80s decade, was like the starting point of what we needed to live, and then for a teenager making $500 a month, making minimum wage in the 80s, with the remaining $300, $75 a month was plenty of money back in the day, like that's $75 a month after putting gas in the car, so and for us, so that's like the starting point. Now in today's time, the minimum wage is $15 an hour, which is roughly about 5 times that of the 80s. So let's say that same person working the same McDonald's for 30 hours a week, like he's starting, this teenager starting, right? So he's making, say, $400 a week for 30 hours. And so now here's the kicker: the apartment, an average apartment in today's times is, say, $2,500 for that same apartment, same decent apartment. And let's say the teenagers are like sharing that apartment with three friends too, like in the 80s, where in the 80s, like two people paid $200 each to have a room, and the other, on the tighter budget, would pay $100 in the living room to sleep in I did that, in my day. But now, if you're talking about like in today's times, you figure like each like two people in a $2,500 apartment would agree to pay $1,000 each one for to have a room, and the third one would pay $500 to sleep in the living room. You know, you figure there would be an agreement on that, right? I mean, but in today's times, gas is $6 a gallon, which is about like 5 times the amount, and the apartment in today's times is about 5 times the amount that it was back then, and gasoline is like at least 5 times the amount, even more. I mean, in today's time. So in today's times, a tank of gas would cost something like $85 in that same 14-gallon tank in a car, and going like the car can go 20 miles a gallon. So and back then too, in today's times, the utilities is a little bit more expensive as well. So utilities, like, it's probably just slightly more expensive. It's not that much, you know, like let's say raise it to $75 in today's times to share the utilities, you know. So there you have it, you know, like in today's times, the starting point of the like the starting point of a beginner, like a beginner person, you know, like starting to begin, how we call it, like a person who decides to start living on his own. A beginner wage would be, well, the beginner times would be about $900 a month. $500 to sleep in the living room in today's times, you know, if they're sharing an apartment. A lot of times, like, either way, I don't care what anybody says, minimum wage in today's time, neither era was affordable. I mean, neither era. Like, we really cannot live with just minimum wage alone, but you can if you're single, I guess. I mean, if you're single, and then you can do it on either era, you know, like I did that in my eras, you know. So the starting point is like $900 in that time, but and so that's approximately 5 times. That's close to 5 times. So now if you're gonna ask me, was it more affordable in the 80s, or what? I mean, was minimum wage more livable in the 80s decade, like considering the the cost of living back then, or is today's times more affordable? What I'm trying to say actually is minimum wage more livable in today's times than minimum wage livable in the 80s. Well, I've come to the conclusion that I think it's about the same, really, because the ratio, the ratio of income to the expenses is about 1 to 5, in either case. You know, the apartment is $2,500 for an average decent apartment, so that's like 5 times more than the average apartment, than that same apartment from the 80s, $500. And the gasoline is $6 a gallon today in California anyway, and then the gasoline was like 80 cents. Maybe it's a little bit more, but like the ratio is higher on the cost of gasoline today versus the 80s, and the cost of, like, and the amount of wages that we get. But the utilities, and, you know, like the tank of gas, I mean, the rent, well, mostly like the rent, you know, like mostly rent, like it's 5 times the minimum wage. It's 5 times, which is exactly 1 to 5 ratio. I mean, the rent is the main thing, really. I mean, and then the gas, it's basically about the same. The ratio is about the same. The income to expense, you know, the most basic expense, you know. So there you have it. Now, if I'm gonna add, if I would add, like, the $300 or the $200 that I said, that the starting point of the expenses in the 80s, if you made $3.35 an hour, and you worked if you worked 30 hours a week, and you got $500 a month, and you only needed $200 a month for the rent and gasoline and your utilities. After that, for which you would have $300 left over, that money, like, typically in my days, those extra $300, well, of course, we'd have our food, and then in my days, I used to use those extra dollars to buy Genesis games or Nintendo games, or I used to buy records and CDs and cassettes. I used to buy those. And then we had a phone bill too. Like, we used to share the phone bill, but I mean, we would have a phone bill. I would typically pay $50 a month for my share if I called those 900 numbers and remember those, like, well, I did not do that a lot, but I mean, well, of course, I had times when we would call long distance friends, or if we had any, or we called people a long distance, like if I had family or something, like we would do our share. Now, versus today, in today's times, like with the $900 that I said, that it's a starting point in the beginner's income, like paying $500 to sleep in the living room in today's time. With the extra, with the extra $600 that I calculated left, which is kind of like 3 times, or 2 times. But anyway, with that, well, back in today's times, a lot of people are buying games off their phone. A lot of people are doing buying downloadable stuff. Yeah. I mean, that's what my kids do anyway. I mean, they buy these gems or coins for their Fortnite or Genshin Impact or whatever. And of course, like in today's times, people might spend their money on MP3s, but but I mean, I think people might like still do things like movie theaters in today's times, or I mean, like people, but that's just like the basics, And then instead of a landline phone, we have a cell phone. So a typical single person will pay $50 a month. It's kind of like the same thing as a phone bill. I mean, so basically, I would have to say it sums it up at about the same. That's the same ratio. I mean, of income to expense. Uh, it's the same ratio, 1 to 5. Like whether it was 80s or today's times. Like because it's the minimum wage. Like the cost of living had gone up, like kind of like basically 5 times that it was in the 80s, but the minimum wage is 5 times higher as well. So I think all in all, it comes out to be evened out. I mean, I would have to think that's totally evened out right there. I mean, so that's the answer that I would opinionize that for that answer. It evens out. I mean, so neither of those eras was more livable than the other for the minimum wage. Neither of the eras minimum wage was more livable than the other. It's the same. It's the same thing. But it's just, you gotta remember that everything is just 5 times more expensive, but we're also getting 5 times more money too. So it kind of evens out, it kind of evens out. So there you have it. All right, I hope you liked this video, and I'll see you on the next video. This is all my opinion only, and also you gotta remember that that's just like the basic starting point of the expense. I did not include like car insurance, and it was kind of assuming that you had a paid off car. I mean, it's just like the basic. I'm just pointing out the basics, just like the basic starting point cost, so yeah, so there you have it. All right, I'll see you on the next video.